I was browsing games released in 2023 for things that might have slipped through the cracks, and found Fall of Porcupine. I knew it had been on my radar before, and checking the store page immediately reminded me of why. This looks like Night in the Woods. I love Night in the Woods. I played it right when it came out, and I can hardly shut up about it now. It means a lot to me, and I was more than ready to try anything associated with, even things it inspired. So, at the turn of fall, I finally played Fall of Porcupine, and it's good. There's a lot in this game I want to talk about, and despite the title, thumbnail, and the way I found this game, it does have its own identity and message. It's here. Fall of Porcupine has something to say, and has feelings it wants you to understand about some of the people that help us most. It is full of powerful moments and has incredible utilization of ludic storytelling, but it is also trapped in a shadow so dark it might as well be night. In the woods. It's not wrong to think of Night in the Woods when you see this game. It's clear they wanted a little association. It is what got me to pick up the game after all. But they took it too far. They didn't use Night in the Woods as inspiration to prop up a game with the story they really wanted to tell. They used it as a foundation and plastered over the parts they didn't need without understanding why they were there to begin with. Fall of Porcupine isn't just a cheap imitation though. It's the same price. I want to make it clear that there are good, unique things in Fall of Porcupine because ties to Night in the Woods get pretty egregious. In a worse game, some of these things would make it easy to write off, but here they just show how well Night in the Woods constructed itself, and how much Fall of Porcupine hurts its own good ideas by taking from it. I'm Rive Royal, and I'm going to look at where the woods stop and the fall begins. Fall of Porcupine was developed by Critical Rabbit, a German studio that primarily has its background in film and web design. Fall of Porcupine is their first major game, and outside of an Alice in Wonderland reference in their About Me page that they wrote like it was supposed to be subtle, I really can't find much more about them. That could be an issue of language. A lot of the press surrounding them seems to be focused on the German market. However, I did come across this short Meet the Devs video released by their publisher, Assemble Entertainment. Assemble is responsible for a lot of smaller games in the region, and has the tagline, "Saving the world, game by game." This made me think they were operating on some sort of charity profit-sharing business model, but no, they are in fact a for-profit privately owned company. The only thing I could find in reference to this tagline is on their LinkedIn, which seems to imply it's just the strength of their catalog. A catalog that includes nearly a dozen Leisure Suit Larry remakes, but I digress. Hi, low-quality editor right here. I actually found this on the DLC page for Fall of Porcupine, which is just where they keep their art book and soundtrack listing. This is the only line I've found now between anything Assemble or Critical Rabbit has put out on any official page about sharing profit, so I guess I'm sorry about that. The Leisure Suit Larry stuff is still absolutely true and pretty funny though. In the other corner, we have Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods came out in 2017 and has had demos since all the way back in 2013. It was developed by Infinite Fall and is one of the publisher Finji's most iconic IPs. I don't need to be coy about it. Anyone can see Fall of Porcupine has more than a passing resemblance to Night in the Woods. The simplistic art style, use of animal characters, platforming-based exploration, and perhaps most notably, the dialogue system. Many NPCs can be talked to, and all dialogue is done through these little text bubbles. It may seem like an inconsequential detail, but these are story-heavy games, with their dialogue being the driving force of that story. Not much more than a sentence can be delivered at once, but characters still have meaningful things to say, and longer stories can be told. It prevents the devs from dropping an entire paragraph of text or backstory on the player. With this system, an incredible conversational flow is given to every interaction, and even things like pauses and awkward slips in speech can be conveyed flawlessly. It's not a one-way street either, as the player, you are given choices on how to respond to the NPCs. These aren't necessarily huge narrative-shifting dialogue trees, but they do work to further engage the player and tighten the pacing. When dialogue is such an integral part of the game, and the flow is uniquely tailored to each conversation, having an influence over that tone and the flow of that conversation is an expressive and meaningful role. There is much more mechanical overlap as well, but I am really trying to focus on Fall of Porcupine. That is the game that came out later and is the one with the gift of hindsight and inspiration, which makes the intersections it does choose to pursue all the stranger. In Fall of Porcupine, you play as Finley, a fresh graduate that has moved to the rural European town of Porcupine to work at St. Ursula's Hospital as a junior doctor. After a brief dream sequence/tutorial, you find yourself tracking down a runaway patient to the abandoned ward on the top floor. You find your patient, but not before coming across some documents that feel weirdly out of place, as if being kept away from prying eyes like yours. While trying to get the patient on their feet, some boxes suddenly fall, knocking you out, and title. After you wake up, the game starts proper. You can explore the town and interact with its inhabitants on your way to work at the hospital. And the hospital is where all of Fall of Porcupine's best ideas originate. The hospital is the one major departure from the style Night in the Woods laid out. On most of the in-game days, you'll be going to the hospital to work, and you are there to work as a junior doctor. You have a superior to shadow and patients of your own to tend to. Every day you get assigned to a set of patients in your task app, which gets a cute semi-diegetic explanation. These tasks will usually boil down to a brief conversation about whatever ails the patient and a mini-game to stand in for whatever action is appropriate. The patients have some of the best interactions in the game, and I have a pretty good guess as to why. I don't know a ton about the development, but I do know that the devs reached out to 20 healthcare workers and asked for their stories and experiences. I'm sure that provided a strong basis, but I wouldn't be surprised if some stories just got translated one-to-one. These interactions really do feel like you're walking your patients through their treatment. There is no judgment, and there isn't always a resolution. Aside from your patients, there is usually some other happening that day you have to attend to. Sometimes it's work-related, like fetching some test samples, and sometimes it's more character-driven, like grabbing lunch with your colleagues. After work, you often hang out with your friends and head to bed to start the whole thing over. Of the days you play throughout the fall and winter, you continue to check on your patients, some of whom you'll be quite familiar with as you tend to more intense afflictions, explore the dynamics of the town, uncover some of the shadier aspects of the hospital alluded to in the intro, and generally learn how to handle your role as a doctor and what it means to be one. I like this plot, and I think it only gets better as it progresses into its final acts. When taken as a whole like this, it is quite different from Night in the Woods, but it really does come down to the hospital. For most of its playtime, Night in the Woods has nothing even closely resembling the kind of structure that the hospital provides. Instead, you play as May Borowski, a 20-year-old returning to her hometown of Possum Springs. May recently dropped out of college for vague reasons even she doesn't seem to fully understand, and just wants to spend time with her old high school friends in town. Which is exactly what you do until the night of Harfest, when May witnesses a kidnapping. May tries to chase the kidnapper down until he seemingly passes through a solid object to escape her. The rest of the game leans into a campfire ghost story narrative on top of all of the underlying issues Possum Springs and its residents hide. In abstract, there is nothing wrong with how Fall of Porcupine's plot is formulated, and considering the focus on plot both of these games have, it might seem unfair to draw these close comparisons to the two. The problem I have with Fall of Porcupine is, despite the different theme and story, the direction, pacing, level design, and plot beats are all but completely lifted from Night in the Woods. Even in this brief slice I've given here, there is already much borrowed from Night in the Woods. The mysterious documents in Fall of Porcupine's introduction that don't quite incite the plot but suggests there is something off is very close in nature to the severed arm you come across at the end of Night in the Woods' first day. The story is stopped abruptly to bring attention to something clearly out of place that hints at the nefarious powers at work in the setting. And as silly as it sounds, hanging out with friends is also directly inspired by Night in the Woods. In Night in the Woods, you don't just hang out with your friends. Who you choose to hang out with determines what you'll be doing that day, what you can do the next, and who you're closer with by the end. You have to choose in Fall of Porcupine too, but there the choice has no impact aside from locking some content to another playthrough. Something that's interesting is that despite the more intense inciting incident and more fantastical tone, Night in the Woods is much more character-driven, and despite the patient interaction being the main activity done each day in Fall of Porcupine, the main plot and events it encompasses drives the theme there. Without the characters in Night in the Woods, the theme would be relegated to a footnote in an otherwise Scooby-Doo-esque mystery plot. Without the characters in Fall of Porcupine, the theme could easily rest on the general goings-on of the events in the plot. The characters we do get to know could easily be substituted for someone completely different without much impact. In fact, the friend system is the perfect place to start when talking about things Fall of Porcupine takes without understanding all the reasons Night in the Woods had it there in the first place. Both of these games have a pretty wide range when it comes to the cast, but the friends surrounding the protagonists are different. These are the characters you interact with most and are there to support and drive the main plot. The core group you are going to be seeing in Night in the Woods is Beatrice, Greg, Angus, and Germ, while in Fall of Porcupine it's just Mia, Pina, and Carl. However, these friends are not equal in terms of how these games let you interact with them. For example, getting to know Germ is more of a side quest in Night in the Woods, and Angus is heavily tied to Greg's arc, so he doesn't get much time to himself. Meanwhile, Pina is actually unavoidable in Fall of Porcupine. She is very much integrated into the plot, and just about every way you can interact with her is placed in your path to beating the game. The remaining 4 characters are the most fleshed out, to the point where the full extent of their content can't be contained to one playthrough of the game. However, this is a decision that makes a lot more sense in Night in the Woods. The biggest question when it comes to content like this is why make it exclusive to multiple playthroughs at all? Why not just have all the content made be in one full playthrough of the game? The easiest answer that applies to both games is pacing. Night in the Woods is about 13 in-game days long, and on 6 of those days you partake in a bespoke hangout with one of your friends. Meaning, if you were to add in the hangouts you get locked out of back in, it could nearly double the length of the game. Doing so would not only significantly weaken the pacing, it would erode the connective tissue of the main plot and town interactions. Fall of Porcupine is very different, though. There are only 3 opportunities to pick a bespoke hangout. However, none of those opportunities are the only thing you are expected to do that day. You'll have a full day at the hospital and likely some other event to deal with before you even get the option to hang out with a friend. Fall of Porcupine integrates its hangouts much more tightly with the plot. If we wanted to insert them all into one playthrough, they would either have to completely derail the plot or make entirely new connective content to insert it elsewhere. It's really out of the question. The decision to make these bespoke set pieces require multiple playthroughs isn't a bad one, and I think was the right choice for Night in the Woods. Like I said, that game's theme is made stronger by its characters. The friends with the hangouts, Beatrice and Greg, hold up the theme in their own unique ways. However, with a stricter adherence to the plot, like Fall of Porcupine, it makes sense that the character moments couldn't stray too far either. Hence why Pina is never optional. This system just doesn't do any favors for its characters or the plot that surrounds them. In not so many words, the plot favors Carl to the point where the theme and resolution is incomplete if you don't stick with him to the end. The game even seems to know this, because every time the hangouts are brought up, Carl's option gets introduced first, and they always seem to follow an event he is more closely tied to. The first hangout occurs the day you meet Carl, not your first day notably, where he invites you to drinks after playing out an elevator ordeal with him at the hospital. Only after all of your work at the hospital is done, and after Carl has given you an invite you probably didn't even think you could turn down, does Mia mention going to exercise with her. I personally can't think of the logic of going with Mia on your first playthrough. Everything points to Carl, which is probably for the best because going with Carl introduces you to Giuliano and the tavern, both of which become critical later in the plot. The second hangout comes shortly after Carl gets laid off from the hospital. If you feel any connection to Carl, I feel like it would be hard to turn down an opportunity to help him at this point. This hangout is largely inconsequential, but it's weird that if you hang out with Mia, the resolution of the night is Mia decides to enter the Harvest Festival cooking contest later in the story. Whereas if you don't hang out with her, she enters anyway. The whole of the festival is centered around her entering the contest, but it just feels cheap that there was a suggestion that your involvement mattered in the first place. Night in the Woods makes reference to the things you would be doing with the character you didn't hang out with, but because it's not tied to the plot, they typically just don't do those things. B mentions the possibility of going to a party, but if you don't go with her, she doesn't go at all. Then, on another playthrough, you can go to that party and learn why that was probably a bigger deal than she initially let on. Even when you're not hanging out with the characters in Night in the Woods, you're still developing them. The most egregious is Fall of Porcupine's last hangout. This might be a bit of a nitpick, but not for nothing, Mia's hangout here is perhaps the worst between both of these games. It's a deduction game where you have to determine a killer based off of the stories the characters came up with. This dialogue system is great for a lot of things, but navigating between 5 sets of multiple paragraph-long backstories delivered one line at a time is absolutely not one of them. What's worse is that Carl's hangout is absolutely critical. Giuliano is important to the main plot in ways that neither of the hangouts can affect, but only Carl's hangouts build him up and resolve him. There is a major event Giuliano is involved in around the halfway point, and Carl's hangout here is the emotional resolution. It's such a disservice to the larger plot to have this point be exclusive to the hangout concept, and not to mention how unfair this is for Mia. Nothing her Hangouts offers ties back in with the plot in the same thematic or emotional ways that Carl's do. I just can't believe this made it all the way to the final game. There are just a lot of similar points in Fall of Porcupine that are just odd. Individually, I wouldn't care, but when there are this many in a game that already can't hide its influence, I can't ignore them. It really feels like there is no such thing as a coincidence in Fall of Porcupine. Like the dream sequences. Tons of stories use dream sequences to examine the character's inner thoughts in a more direct way, and Fall of Porcupine uses them fine. Only twice, but they are fine. But are they here because they thought it would be the best way to examine how Finley was processing the events of the plot, or because it's the thing Night in the Woods does? Or the platforming. The whole game is obviously built around being a platformer, but Night in the Woods really runs with it. The aforementioned dream sequences are basically just platforming interludes to vibe to. Platforming is something the game cares about and wants you to interact with frequently. May can even triple jump. Finley can jump and even glide, but there are only about 3 instances in the entire game where platforming is justified in the slightest, and 2 of them are optional. Is Alfio here to comment on how the homeless are treated, especially in regards to healthcare? Or is it because Bruce was one of Night in the Woods' strongest and longest subplots? What about this fishing guy? Or these cult members? Or the elder that tells you about the history of the town? What else? The graffiti? The inclusion of a grocery store even though you can't go inside in Fall of Porcupine? The ball physics? It is so easy to get cynical really quickly when looking closely at all these small things, but I don't want to. I honestly don't want to dig through this game and find a comparison to Night in the Woods for every little thing. That's not the point. It just bothers me that it's all there. There is just so much, and as much as I want to ignore it, there are other things that are so egregiously taken that I can't help but notice all these little throwaway details that just add fuel to the fire. After the first act of both of these games, the town throws its annual Harvest Festival, or Harfest. There are games and stories, and all the local businesses come and show off their wares. Night in the Woods is admittedly more spooky in tone, but it's otherwise indistinguishable. It's not just the fact that it's aesthetically similar, it's the purpose it serves. These festivals come at almost exactly the same time in their relative stories, and both serve as a major turning point in the plot. May witnesses the kidnapping, an incredible act of violence she can't even convince other people is really happening. And Finley loses his first patient. A patient no one even considered would never be leaving that hospital again. This is the inciting incident for both games, and they are different enough beats. I hate that Fall of Porcupine's strongest moment is still in the shadow of Night in the Woods' biggest set piece. Why did this have to be here, Why did there have to be a Harfest in Fall of Porcupine? Did it really need a place to put its big stew competition subplot? Did it need to come up with an excuse why a few characters wouldn't be available to come to the hospital in the middle of the night? Did it really need a whole festival to get this candle onto this table? Or is it here because Harfest is a striking thing to do with a rural town, and Night in the Woods pivoted its story so well around its festival? Is that why it's here? Fall of Porcupine's Harfest bothers me from a pacing perspective, sure, but what it drives home even more is just how little it understands Possum Springs. Night in the Woods is incredible for many reasons. The aesthetic, the music, the dialogue, the characters, they're all great. But its biggest accomplishment is its setting, Possum Springs. Possum Springs is what makes the game work on just about every level. It is a physical representation of the game's themes and the source of so many of the characters' problems. Possum Springs is an American Appalachian mining town that no longer has its mine. In its place is a hole at the center of everything that seems to suck all of the mine built but left behind. It's not a ruin or a ghost town though, people are still living their lives and raising their families here. It's not a very big town, but that works to its benefit because every screen has something to do every day. Sometimes it's a plaque detailing the history of a place, or it's an old memory that May shares with the player about her time growing up there. It's best when it's new people to talk to. There are tons of interactions to be had over the weeks you play. A lot of unique one-off stories, but just as many repeating characters that you either engage and grow a relationship with, or ignore them. Just like real life. Porcupine, on the other hand... Wait a minute. Anyway... Porcupine, on the other hand, is just a poor imitation. Every aspect is lacking in comparison to Possum Springs. Just take the layout. Night in the Woods is a much bigger game, and that's true in every way except one. Spatially. Porcupine is several screens larger than the main layout of Possum Springs. This may not seem like a problem until you consider that it adopted one major layout choice Night in the Woods made. In Night in the Woods, your friends, aka the thing you have to do each day to progress the story, are on the other side of the map from May's house, where you start. It is much the same in Porcupine. Your job at the hospital is about the farthest point on the map from where your flat is. However, it's not only farther, there's less to do. These games are platformers, but only Possum Springs is built like one. There are several areas only accessible via platforming, and a lot of NPCs and dialogue lines can only be found by exploring. To its credit, Fall of Porcupine does this too. Once. For an optional mission. That only changes 1 or 2 lines of dialogue in the game. Fall of Porcupine doesn't seem to grasp all the things that Night in the Woods did to justify its platforming mechanics in general. This really is the most significant example of it, and it's optional and bad. So many of these areas are just flat and bland. Possum Springs isn't a Mario level, but it is still pretty vertical, and even when it's not, it often has branching paths that hold some reason to visit multiple times. Fall of Porcupine seems to think that the realism of having more areas that you do stuff in is worth the massive inconveniences of traversing it every day. Night in the Woods knows how valuable town exploration is. It knows you need to see this place and talk to its inhabitants to get the full experience. It doesn't let you skip the walk. Fall of Porcupine knows its town is largely pointless and annoying to traverse because it does let you skip the walk. There's a bus that drops you right in front of the hospital on most days. What's worse is that I took it. I didn't for nearly an entire playthrough, mind you, but I did eventually. There's just no reason for Porcupine's existence as a game space. This comes down to 2 things: the townsfolk and Finley. That may sound unreasonable to those familiar with Fall of Porcupine, because the townsfolk play a key role in the plot and are a huge thematic beat, but almost none of that is out in the town. There is a nice line here and there, but everything you need to get the full experience with the townsfolk is put in your path following the main plot. Their kindness and traditions are found in Pina, the unskippable companion. The daily struggles of the common member of the community is found in every hospital bed you visit every day on the job. The discourse and unstable relationship the hospital has with the rest of the town is found in the main plot, not in the town. A solid third of what you can experience in Night in the Woods is in the town. Not just dialogue, but more bespoke set pieces that can easily be missed. It's not just more stuff to do, it all feels relevant. Compared to what the main characters are struggling with, the problems of the townfolk are not insignificant. They are parallel. It drives home how anyone can be feeling and experiencing these things in a time and place, like Possum Springs. Finley is the perfect crystallization of my problems here. As the perspective character, he is a terrible conduit to convey the history and significance of Porcupine. He is not from Porcupine, he is from the Nebulous City, which itself could have been a good conflict, but his outsiderness in regards to the plot isn't about how he's not from the town, it's that he is from the hospital. It's useful that he has to be told everything about the town because we, the players, need to be told that too. However, just being told the information doesn't instantly form a connection. Porcupine doesn't mean anything to him, and that's to say nothing of the stuff that is left without comment or only given context through Finley's inner dialogue. It's not that it's poorly written or a poor characterization for Finley, it's just that it adds so little to how we feel about Porcupine. There is already precious little in regard to the world building of Porcupine, and what we do have has to be processed through Finley, which gives us even less to connect to. In other words, it is so important that May is from Possum Springs, because there is that relationship to it. May can give her inner dialogue about the town too, but so often is it from the perspective of how things changed for the worse, or perhaps even more dire, didn't change at all. It's not as if she never gets things explained to her. It's perfectly understandable she doesn't know about the political inner workings and history of her hometown. She's 20. What's more is that when she does learn these new things, context is added to her memories and her relationship to the town. It can change the way she feels about it. There is almost nothing in the town that is left without context. Sometimes it's the raw world building of the town's history. Sometimes it's a thing May knows about and can give the perspective of someone who's been around that thing their whole life, and even if it's something she doesn't know a lot about, it's likely she still has a feeling or story about it, or maybe knows how it relates to other people in the town. This also applies to the people too. More often than not, she knows them. Not in close personal ways, but the way you'd know a name of the kid you'd see in the class from one period before yours, or the way you'd know someone because you share a doctor. Because, of course you do, there really is only the one in town. Enough to be aware of each other and start a conversation, but not enough to know that the family member you asked about actually passed a few years back. It's hard to get a grasp on what Porcupine is actually like and how the people there feel about it, if that even matters to the story at all, while Possum Springs feels absolutely real. Which is probably because it is. I do know that Possum Springs is based on the American Appalachians because the developers have confirmed it is based on their experiences in similar Pennsylvanian towns. I don't know if it was based on one specific town, and I don't really care. I don't think the specifics matter. Possum Springs is a kind of place that exists all over America. A lot of people are living in a Possum Springs right now, or have something similar. So, here is mine. My personal Possum Springs is Platteville, Wisconsin. It is actually where I was living when I first played Night in the Woods. It too is a mining town without its mine. It's about 20 miles from somewhere and about 80 miles from somewhere good. Sitting at a population of around 11,000 makes it practically metropolitan in comparison to the rest of the county it's in. There are obviously tons of differences. For one, it's not even in the same time zone. I have been to Pennsylvania and the Appalachians plenty of times, and the landscape alone is enough to change the trajectory of a town's history, despite the similar origins. But when it comes to Possum Springs, what is similar is straight up uncanny. It's clear the creators of Night in the Woods either did their homework or have a dedicated passion for portraying life in towns like this, because it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. I was actually so interested in seeing the differences myself, I made a wholly separate, fully produced piece on my Patreon, going over the overlap of the two towns. I'm no cinematographer, but it doesn't take much to make the comparisons look great. And if you head over to patreon.com/RyeRoyal yourself, I'll even show you the mine. Now, you may very well be able to do similar comparisons for Porcupine. Other than being vaguely rural Germany, I couldn't find any more specific influences. But it doesn't matter. Nothing about the town of Porcupine is important to the core themes of the game. Nearly the whole basis for Night in the Woods' existence is basically an afterthought to Fall of Porcupine. That's it. Just about everything Fall of Porcupine gets wrong about Night in the Woods can be traced back to Possum Springs. As someone who knows firsthand just how much Night in the Woods cares about the reality of its setting, it will never stop bothering me just how completely Fall of Porcupine misses that mark. However, as I said, I don't think the game is bad, and it really does do some genuinely unique things that Night in the Woods can't hold a candle to. So, as much as the porcupine of it all is hard to get past, let's end this off with what Fall of Porcupine does well. These games share a lot, but the most impactful thing that Fall of Porcupine has that the two share is minigames. Both games have a host of minigames that all serve different purposes. This is another case of Night in the Woods just having a lot more to draw from, but for all of the crossover in these games, I don't think there is a single meaningful analog for a single minigame between the two. It's all about the way minigames are used that makes their inclusion worth talking about. Night in the Woods did a lot with them, but when I say minigames, I'm talking about interactions that take place outside of the platforming or dialogue. One of the first interactions in the game is perhaps the simplest example, while also being the perfect rep for why these are here. All you do is control May's hand to make a choice on a vending machine and then pick up your drink. This is a tutorial for other interactions like this. I think they are here to draw you into the world a bit more, to make you feel present in a more physical way, and to its credit, Fall of Porcupine doesn't even try these. The physicality of being in the world they made was not a feeling they needed to convey, and the smaller interactions like these would have felt unnecessary, and therefore even more derivative. There are also more minigames, where it really is just a bespoke little minigame that represents another action that you are doing in the narrative. Anything from water balloon toss to archery to knife fights. All of these are stand-ins for activities the normal play-space wouldn't do justice. They are unique interactions too, so they are going to stand out in the player's mind, which makes them such perfect accompaniments to character moments. The attachment is more tangible. These are the minigames Fall of Porcupine has a particular interest in. There isn't a mechanical overlap, so the only thing that deserves direct comparison is the structure. Night in the Woods doesn't always have a minigame to go along with its friend hangouts, but Fall of Porcupine does, coming out to 6-ish minigames just to do with your friends. Also, it's worth mentioning that another type of minigame Fall of Porcupine doesn't really emulate are the ones Night in the Woods built around the normal world navigation and platforming controls. It's just another way Fall of Porcupine really didn't know how to adapt the platforming to the game it had. Despite how much I do appreciate the effort here, these hangout minigames are the weaker ones, and again, part of me can't help but wonder if they are just here because Night in the Woods had them during their hangouts. No, where Fall of Porcupine's minigames shine is at the hospital. As I mentioned, you get 3 tasks assigned to you each and every day. These are the patients you have to visit, and along with a brief conversation, you end each visit with a treatment minigame. There are only 5 total minigames that repeat, but they are the 5 best in the game, and they also change in interesting ways. There is this basic rhythm-based one that, despite looking like the bass sections in Night in the Woods, plays significantly differently and serves as the role of your stethoscope. This Simon Says-esque wound dressing one, this one that is your classic mastermind clone that acts as your diagnostic, this bar balancing one for prescribing medication, and lastly this injection game, which is the closest the game gets to operation and needing a steady hand. All of these games grade your performance too, which may sound stressful, but I actually found it to be a relief in comparison to pass-fail minigames Night in the Woods is particularly fond of. These are the most fun and engaging minigames on offer, which is great because if there is one place the game needed a deeper connection to be formed, it is in the hospital. I also like the ways these games represent their given task. The diagnostic and prescription games are puzzles, asking you to think carefully about what you are doing. Time and dexterity isn't a factor here. The other three are performance-based, so the tasks they represent are ones that require a more active role. That gets a little muddy with the stethoscope one, because despite me calling it that, I don't think it's supposed to be a direct analog 100% of the time, because these games change. It's actually here, when talking about the minigames, that I think it's the most appropriate time to bring up some of the major events surrounding the hospital. Your first few days at the hospital have pretty low stakes. Some stomach aches, some fatigue, and so on. My favorite example is Larissa. This young girl is just learning that she has asthma and hasn't fully come to grips with how it impacts her life. You talk with her about some of the things she needs to be careful with from now on, and then check her breathing with the stethoscope minigame. As the first time you play this minigame, it's pretty easy. There can be any one of the face buttons on any of the 3 stick positions at any time. But since this is a healthy enough young girl, it is pretty regular, only gaining some more dramatic patterns after a longer period of focused breathing. She is recovering from an asthma attack after all. All of the minigames get introduced like this. It lets you learn them, and it's not hard to get near perfect scores in the first few days. You also don't get all of them right away. It's mostly wound dressing and stethoscope tests before moving on to the more puzzly games. The prescription one is probably the easiest, with some of the earlier solutions falling into place after just a few choices. The diagnostic game is another standout for me though. The first time you play that game is when Irma, Juliana from the tavern's mother, is admitted into your ward. She fell faint and was brought in, but seems fairly healthy on all accounts. The diagnostic seems simple, with just a few slots to fill out and only a small selection of options per slot. The games are fine, and I like the way they represent what action you are supposedly doing, but they wouldn't be worth mentioning if they didn't change. You'll notice it first in the wound dressing and stethoscope games. As if to throw you in the true line of fire, you move from patients largely in recovery, like in your first few days, to patients that are in need of active care. In a very short time, the wound game goes from a walking-paced game of Simon Says to a game of controller twister. It gets so difficult it borders on absurd, as you are hitting buttons with fingers you never even thought to try before. Grab any controller and try to follow this. It's ridiculous, but I like how frantic it gets. The stethoscope game gets dramatically harder too, as you lose the rhythm of breath quickly in favor of hitting whatever you can manage. All of this is mirrored in your patients as well. The injection minigame is always relatively simple, but as you have to perform on sicker and sicker patients, you have to account for the amount of trembling they are experiencing. This is again best reflected in the diagnostic minigame. You are doing this game with other patients too, but you always have to do it with Irma. Even after a seemingly straightforward diagnosis, her condition continues to worsen. Trying to figure out new courses of action, your diagnosis requires more and more thought. More position, more options in each position, less results. It doesn't matter how well you do or how much you try to comfort her, she declines until the night of the Harfest. Your senior doctor tells you you haven't missed a beat in your work, but the only thing to do for her now is to make her last moments comfortable. One story from her youth and one candle later, she's gone. As a player, you probably knew this moment was coming. She was the patient you attended to the most, and the diagnosis only got more and more dire each time. But the town didn't see this coming. She went in for something small and never came out. They are blindsided by her loss, and some of them blame you. The town has a tenuous relationship to the hospital. As the population ages, it seems that it only becomes a place for bad news. To add to that frustration, the hospital seems to be in some state of neglect, and no one really seems to know what the source is. So you have strained resources at the hospital, and a less than grateful population making the job harder. Following the plot draws threads to the very beginning of the game and those mysterious documents. Is someone up to something? Is the hospital really to blame? Perhaps someone is stirring up the town to cover their tracks. The hospital is rapidly falling apart, and the town has come to express their doubts. You go deeper into the basement looking for clues, and just when it seems like everything is about to unravel, a pandemic hits. As a protest outside rages, people begin collapsing without warning. Before long, the rooms are full. Then the halls. Trying to get the abandoned ward back up and running, and escaping isn't enough. The local school's auditorium is now full of desperate patients, and you have to work. That means more minigames. But look at this chaos. You don't have time for diagnostics, and you're not getting prescriptions tonight. You can only give your attention to the most desperate cases, dressing wounds and monitoring heart rates. The games are crazy, making the difficulty spike after your first week seem like cake. You try to keep up, watching the patterns go absolutely everywhere, until the game ends a few dialogue trees the following morning. It's mentioned offhand how one of the higher-ups is being taken in for some kind of embezzlement scheme, but it seems irrelevant at this point. You don't get a neat resolution with the town. You're not even sure who's left, really. The ending is desperate, sad, and empty. And I love it. I have a lot of problems with this game, but the way the ending was handled is not one of them. For everything that was callously taken from Night in the Woods, it's clear that there was a real desire to give weight to the healthcare-centric story. It's dramatized and a little condensed, but everyone was given a pretty clear look into the world of healthcare recently, and I think it's safe to say the intensely desperate feeling it portrays is not unearned. It's such a strong theme done so well that I honestly wish that the game was just that. If this game started you in the hospital every day and kept the stories between the healthcare workers, their patients, and their colleagues, I think this could have been an amazing short experience. Instead, it's a game that fails to live up to the thing it is desperately begging to be compared to. This game has its own ideas, but instead of focusing on them, it tries to expand itself to its own detriment. However, even with all that said, I'm glad it exists. And I hope more games try to experiment with similar styles because I love experiencing stories like this. In the meantime, I'm Rye Royal, and I'll see you in the next one.